On my daughter's birthday, my parents handed her an empty envelope with the words, "It's empty because we don't care about you. We hope you don't grow up to be a loser like your mom." My 11-year-old daughter burst into tears while they laughed and whispered, "They're hardly family anymore." I smiled, opened the front door, and told them to leave. I didn't scream or argue. I simply watched them go, because something inside me had gone completely still. 2 weeks later, my WhatsApp was drowning in messages from those same people. "We need you, please help." By then, I already had a plan. Ava had talked about her birthday for weeks. She wanted a backyard party, cupcakes, her favorite pink tablecloth, and her best friends from school. My husband and I did everything we could to make it perfect. He helped Ava decorate cupcakes from his wheelchair while I grilled burgers, and we hung lights the night before. For once, life felt easy. I hadn't wanted my parents there. Neither had my husband. But Ava still believed being her grandparents meant they cared. "There's still Grandma and Grandpa," she told me. So we let them come. They arrived halfway through the party with no hello, gift, or smile. My mother walked directly to Ava and handed her a plain white envelope. I saw her grin before Ava opened it. My daughter stared at the page, then slowly handed it to me. One sentence sat in the middle. "It's blank because we don't care about you, and we don't want you to become a failure like your mother." My husband pulled Ava close as she fought not to cry in front of her friends. My father smiled. My mother whispered something to him, and they both laughed. Then Dad muttered, loud enough for me to hear, "They're not family anymore." I said nothing. I held the door open and watched them leave, as if they hadn't just humiliated an 11-year-old at her birthday party. That night, after everyone was gone and Ava was asleep, I sat in the dark with my phone in one hand and a beer in the other. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. For years, my parents had treated me like an embarrassment. When my husband lost his mobility after the accident, they disappeared. They ignored the medical bills, the home modifications, everything. Once, when I begged my father for help, he said, "You should have made better choices." I never asked again. Until that envelope, I thought maybe I was the only one they hated. Then they went after my daughter. I knew things about my parents I had never said aloud. Details about their finances, the family property, assets hidden during my grandfather's estate transfer, and pieces of my father's business dealings I had overheard when I was younger. I also knew what they feared most, losing control. They didn't know I still had access to the second storage unit in my father's name. They didn't know I had kept copies of documents connected to my grandfather's will. And they didn't know I had spent almost a year quietly consulting an estate attorney named Dana after my mother accidentally mentioned plans to redirect the inheritance. I decided not to confront them. That would give them time to prepare. Instead, through a friend who still did accounting work for local families, I let a rumor travel. Brianna still has the original documents. There may have been probate violations. The land transfer could be challenged. Then I waited. Exactly 2 weeks after Ava's birthday, the messages began. First, my mother, then my father, then cousins and relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years. Every message meant the same thing. "We need you. Please help us." Step 1 had worked. On the third day of silence, the calls started. Morning, afternoon, evening. I ignored my parents, and even the cousin who once called my husband the crippled husband when he thought I couldn't hear. Then a certified letter arrived from a law firm I didn't recognize. It requested a meeting and said my parents were eager to resolve potential misunderstandings regarding the estate, while preserving family unity. I almost laughed. Family unity? From people who had made my daughter cry for sport. I forwarded the letter to Dana with one sentence. "It's time." She filed a petition asking the county court to investigate my grandfather's estate. We included copies of documents I had saved, including evidence that a signature tied to my Aunt Karen's share had been forged to avoid dividing the land with her. Karen was my mother's sister, and my parents believed I hadn't spoken to her in 20 years. In reality, I had been visiting her for months. My parents had also built a small guest house on one parcel while claiming full ownership, and it wasn't properly zoned. When a county inspector appeared with a clipboard and camera, their panic became impossible to hide. That was when my father stopped sounding angry. I finally answered one call. He sounded exhausted and said family shouldn't turn on family. He asked to meet face to face, so I agreed. We chose a diner on Route 73, a place he used to take me when I was a child. He arrived without his usual smugness. After 20 minutes, he admitted the truth. They weren't trying to preserve the land. They were trying to sell it to an out-of-state development group for close to 7 figures. The deal had been underway for months, but Dana's inquiry had scared the buyer. Everything was now frozen. Dad leaned toward me. "We need you to withdraw the petition. We'll make it worth your time." Then he pushed an envelope across the table. I didn't open it. I stood and walked out, because he still didn't understand how far ahead I was. Aunt Karen had already signed an affidavit agreeing to reopen probate. More importantly, she had given me a handwritten note from my grandfather. "If anything happens to me, Brianna knows where the real will is. She's the only one I trust." My parents thought they had buried the truth years ago. Standing outside that diner, I realized my grandfather had left me a map. They needed me now, and I was only beginning to dig. I waited until Friday to make my next move because timing mattered. My parents had a meeting that morning with the developers offering almost $1 million for the family land, and while they were probably putting on expensive clothes and rehearsing fake smiles, I was standing inside a 24-hour FedEx printing more than 30 pages of documents. I had the probate petition, photographs of the zoning violations, copies of the disputed estate records, and something even worse. My father had spent years dealing in antiques, but according to a man named Mitch who once worked with one of Dad's dealers, furniture and restored pieces weren't the only things changing hands. Thousands of dollars had moved through under-the-table sales with no proper records and no taxes. Years earlier, Mitch had mentioned keeping copies of the books. I called him and offered $10,000 for them. He emailed them to me for free. That Friday morning, while my parents sat across from the development group, trying to convince them everything was perfectly legitimate, every important person involved in the purchase received information showing that the land they wanted was tied to a probate dispute, zoning problems, potential estate fraud, and financial activity that could attract tax investigators. The developers didn't negotiate. They didn't ask my parents for an explanation. They simply walked away. Within hours, the $1 million deal was dead. By 4 that afternoon, my father's antique shop was closed. I knew because I drove past and saw him locking the front door. For the first time in my life, I saw something stronger than arrogance on his face. Panic. That night, I met Aunt Karen at a diner nearly an hour away. She arrived carrying a small, locked metal container and placed it between us. "Your grandfather expected this eventually," she said. Inside was the document my parents had spent years pretending didn't exist, the real will. My grandfather had ordered the land divided equally between my mother and Karen. If either sister interfered with or refused the division, the property was supposed to pass to me. That clause was missing from the version filed after his death. The document Karen gave me was handwritten, notarized, and dated after the version my parents had relied on. I stared at my grandfather's signature until my eyes burned. My parents hadn't merely manipulated an inheritance. They had erased his final wishes. Saturday morning, my mother arrived at our house without calling. She looked almost unrecognizable. No jewelry, no carefully done makeup, no superior expression. Ava was sitting nearby with headphones on, and my husband was beside the window in his wheelchair. Mom asked to speak privately, but I didn't move. She started explaining that families were complicated, and people made mistakes. Then she blamed me for being too sensitive. Finally, desperation cracked through her voice. "If you care about your daughter's future, you'll stop this." I laughed so suddenly that even my husband looked at me. "Ava's future," I told her, "is exactly why I'm not stopping." I explained that Dana had the forged documents. Karen was supporting the reopened probate case, and every signature and message we had collected was being preserved. "The only deal left," I said, "is one I write." Mom walked out without saying goodbye. By Monday, Dana filed the full petition seeking control of the estate on my behalf. With Karen's affidavit, the authentic will, the zoning violations, and the financial evidence surrounding my father's business, my parents had almost nowhere to hide. Then I made another call to the IRS. I remembered my husband lying in a hospital bed after the accident, while I calculated how many weeks of medication we could afford. I remembered selling things we owned, because my parents wouldn't help. I remembered my father telling me I should have made better choices. Most of all, I remembered Ava holding that birthday envelope while her grandparents laughed. So when the county court, IRS, and zoning board began sending notices to my parents' house, I didn't feel guilty. I felt finished, pretending their cruelty deserved protection. Then Dana found the weakness that changed everything. Because Karen's share had been bypassed with a forged signature, and the authentic will contained completely different instructions, the previous estate transfer could be treated as fraudulent. The property had to return to probate. That meant assets could be liquidated or auctioned while ownership was untangled: the land, antique inventory, furniture, and even the illegally developed guest house. My parents believed losing control of those things was the worst possible outcome. They were wrong because nearly a year earlier, after first becoming suspicious about the inheritance, I had quietly established an LLC connected to a trust named after my daughter, Ava Field's Trust. Using proxies, I began buying everything that entered auction. My parents never recognized the names attached to the transactions. The land they had expected to sell for almost $1 million cost me roughly $126,000. The antique store inventory went for around $14,000. The guest house cost another $31,000. Piece by piece, the empire they had protected more fiercely than their own family changed hands. By the time they learned who controlled it, the transfers were already complete. I drove to the property they had once implied I would never be worthy of owning, walked onto the porch of the guest house, and taped a note to the door. The land belongs to Ava now, just like everything else you threw away. 2 days later, Dad called. Then Mom. I ignored both. That weekend, my husband and I took Ava to see the property. She wore bright rain boots and ran across the field as if she had discovered another world. My husband rolled carefully along the gravel path behind her, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. Watching them, I understood that none of this mattered because of the money. It mattered because my daughter had been made to feel unwanted. And now something her grandparents had valued above people would eventually belong to the child they said wasn't family. That night, Karen knocked on our door holding another letter. Her face was pale. After reopening the estate, she had uncovered records from a private bank in South Carolina. My grandfather had created a second trust account that nobody in the family knew existed. Access depended on a special clause in his original estate instructions. The account had been untouched since the 1990s and held more than $300,000. The designation beside it read, "For emergency use by the heir of integrity." The beneficiary was me. I sat there staring at those words because I had spent most of my life believing my parents' version of me, that I was disappointing, foolish, and somehow less deserving. Yet, my grandfather had apparently seen something else decades earlier. I opened the trust, but I didn't keep the money for myself. I created a college fund for Ava, enough to protect her education regardless of where she eventually wanted to go. If she chose a university across the country and never wanted to return to this town, she would have that freeing. For several weeks afterward, life became strangely quiet. The IRS froze much of my parents' remaining financial activity. Their store was padlocked and stripped of inventory, and word reached us that they had moved into a cheap apartment across town. Ava slowly became herself again. We spent weekends walking the property, talking about trees, gardens, and the kind of place she might build there someday. My husband seemed lighter, too. I began believing the worst was finally over. Then one morning, I walked into our office and noticed a drawer hanging open. The back door was unlocked. Nothing valuable appeared stolen. The television was still there. The computers hadn't been touched. Someone had searched only certain drawers and cabinets, and one object was missing: the metal box that had once contained the authentic will. I already had the document scanned, copied, and filed with Dana, so stealing it changed nothing legally. But whoever broke into our house either didn't know that or wasn't trying to destroy the case completely. Maybe they wanted leverage. Maybe they wanted to frighten me. I filed a police report, changed the locks, installed cameras, and created multiple backups of every document. 3 days later, my phone rang from a blocked number. I answered, expecting Dana or Karen. A voice I didn't recognize said, "If you care about Ava's safety, you'll drop the case, all of it." I didn't argue. I hung up and contacted the police. Investigators eventually traced what they could to a prepaid burner phone purchased with cash at a gas station less than 10 minutes from my parents' new apartment. I didn't tell Ava what had happened. I didn't tell my husband every detail either. Instead, I copied everything again: paper, cloud storage, USB drives. Karen received one set, Dana another, and a third went into a bank safe deposit box. Then I did something my parents would never expect. I disappeared digitally and waited for whoever had threatened us to believe I was afraid. On the fourth night, a black sedan entered the driveway of our former rental house. The property was supposed to be empty. I drove there with police positioned nearby and watched from half a block away as my father stepped out holding a crowbar. He walked toward the porch like he still controlled everything. Then 2 officers emerged from the darkness and called his name. Dad froze. He placed the crowbar on the ground and allowed them to handcuff him. My mother was sitting inside the sedan. She refused to get out until officers threatened to break the window. The police couldn't immediately prove every part of the threatening call, but they had enough for a restraining order and a deeper investigation. I thought I had finally reached the bottom of what my parents were capable of. The next morning, Dana called and proved me wrong. "Brianna," she said quietly, "we found something else, and this time, it's in your name." Dana's voice had a weight to it that made me sit down before she even explained. The probate court had uncovered an old debt connected to the property, something registered in my parents' names more than 15 years earlier from a failed business they had kept mostly off the books. There was a lien attached to the estate, supposedly held by an LLC in Arizona. At first, it looked like another complication, until investigators discovered the LLC wasn't real. Someone had created it using my father's tax information and a false address, which meant the original inheritance transfer wasn't only compromised by the forged signature, it was tangled in hidden liabilities and potential fraud. The court ordered a complete financial audit covering every account, asset, loan, and major transaction my parents had touched for the previous 20 years. Dana thought that would be the final blow. Then the auditors found an account with my name on it. The account had been opened when I was 16. My parents had used forged signatures to create it, and over the years, tens of thousands of dollars had moved through it. Loans had been taken out under my identity. Debts had been attached to my name. Money had been transferred to people I had never heard of. Dana spread the records across her conference table, while I stared at pages that somehow described a financial life I had never lived. "If the IRS treats these transactions as yours," she said carefully, "you could become responsible, unless you formally establish that you were a victim and press charges." I almost laughed at the absurdity. My parents had spent my entire life calling me irresponsible while secretly using my identity as their personal financial dumping ground. What hurt most wasn't even the numbers. Some transfers corresponded to vacations my parents had taken while my husband was hospitalized after the accident. Other money had paid contractors during their kitchen remodel. The same marble countertops my mother once proudly told me represented what happened when people worked instead of asking for handouts. At the time, I had been selling possessions and calculating medication costs while sleeping beside my husband's hospital bed. They hadn't merely refused to help us. They had been spending money borrowed through my identity while watching us struggle. Dana looked at me across the documents. "Brianna, you have enough here to pursue fraud and identity, theft charges, possibly financial abuse as well." For the first time since this began, I didn't answer immediately. I drove home and sat outside while Ava ran through the yard with 2 friends. She was laughing so hard she could barely breathe. My husband rolled beside me and stayed silent until the girls disappeared around the side of the house. Eventually, I told him everything. The forged accounts, the loans, the vacations, the possibility that my parents had been building debts in my name since I was a teenager. He listened without interrupting, then rested his hand over mine. "Do whatever gives you peace," he said. That sentence followed me all evening. I realized peace no longer meant convincing my parents to understand what they had done. They understood. They simply believed consequences were something other people suffered. That night, I called Dana. "File everything." Within a week, investigators froze additional accounts, and warrants followed. I pressed charges for fraud, identity theft, and financial abuse. I didn't celebrate when Dana called with updates. By then, revenge felt smaller than what I wanted. I wanted the record to show what had actually happened. I wanted Ava to grow up knowing that family titles did not excuse cruelty. Most of all, I wanted every debt and signature separated from my name before any of it could touch her future. Then, just when I thought there could be no more secrets buried inside my grandfather's past, a letter arrived from a man named Everett Lewis. Everett said he had worked for my grandfather decades earlier, when the old man still personally handled land leases. He had seen news about the probate dispute and claimed he possessed something that belonged to me. I met him at an aging warehouse outside town. He was in his 70s, wearing an oil-stained jacket, with a handshake that felt like a rusted vice. Without much conversation, he led me down a narrow corridor to storage unit 81. Inside sat an old cedar chest. Everett told me my grandfather had placed it there in 1997, with simple instructions. Keep it safe and give it to Brianna when the time was right. My hands shook when I lifted the lid. Inside were journals, dozens of them, all handwritten by my grandfather. There were photographs I had never seen, stories about how he built his business, and letters addressed to me for birthdays he never got to celebrate after his relationship with my parents collapsed. I sat on the warehouse floor reading, until I lost track of time. In the final journal was a note. "If you're reading this, you fought harder than I ever could. Use what I left you to build something that will last." Beneath everything else was a deed. 10 acres of untouched forest in the northern part of the county, purchased by my grandfather in 1985 and quietly placed in trust for me. My parents had fought over one piece of land for years, without realizing the most important property had never belonged to them at all. 3 months later, we broke ground there. Not on the property poisoned by lawsuits, arguments, and memories of my parents, but on those 10 untouched acres. We designed the house around my husband's mobility from the beginning. A wide ramp into the front entrance, open hallways, accessible counters, and doors that never made him feel like an afterthought. Ava chose colors for every room. My husband chose the layout, cabinets, and lighting. He told me he wanted the kitchen to feel like sunlight. I made sure it did. Karen began visiting almost every weekend, usually carrying pie and somehow always bringing cake too. The woman my mother had erased from our family became one of the people Ava trusted most. Dana came to the property dedication, carrying a framed certificate for Ava. It named her founder of the Ava Fields Trust for Courage and Heritage of Fire. Ava hung it above her desk, like it was the most important award in the world. As for my parents, the last thing I heard was that they had filed for bankruptcy while the fraud investigation continued. Their antique business was gone. Their property was gone. Their accounts were being examined. Their names gradually stopped appearing in our conversations. Ava never asked about them anymore, and I stopped forcing myself to think about whether they regretted anything. Regret was their responsibility, not mine. Sometimes I still remember that birthday afternoon, the plain white envelope in Ava's hands, my mother's grin, my father laughing while my daughter tried not to cry. Back then, they believed an empty envelope proved we had nothing. They were wrong. Ava has land in her future, a protected college fund, a home where her father can move freely, an aunt who loves her, and journals filled with proof that someone before us understood what family was supposed to mean. My parents tried to erase us because they thought control was the same thing as love. In the end, I didn't need to destroy them. I only had to stop protecting them from the consequences of what they had done. We don't owe anything to the people who tried to break us. We owe everything to what we build next. And standing on my grandfather's land, with Ava laughing outside and my husband beside me, I finally understood that we were only getting started. What would you have done if your own parents betrayed your child like that? Would you have fought back or simply walked away? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you want more stories like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.